Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Spanglish Sports World English Edition here on the Sports Spanglish World Network and Single TV channels 249 and 250. Remember to please go to the respective stores of iOS and Android to download the Single TV app, where you will be able to find the best programming in sports, entertainment, and everything that you want to see. Remember as well that you can that the application is completely free, so there is no reason why not to download it and enjoy it. Single TV can also be found through Google Chromecast, Amazon Fire, and Amazon Fire TV Sticks, YouTube and YouTube Stick, and on all smart TVs 2016 and forward. In your screen, you can see my partner in crime, Mr. Ari Shapiro, and
all these years we've known each other, and you keep wanting to pronounce my name Shapiro. And you know what? That's cool. I don't mind. I used to be bothered by it, but as the Blue Jays get better, I don't mind being called Shapiro.
So today's show, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be one of controversy because the city of Toronto seems to love that kind of thing for some reason lately in sports and in politics. So we are going to touch on different angles of stories that have created controversy along, some good, some bad. And we'll open the floor today with Major League Baseball and Robbie Alomar, a story that over the past month has been very hot because he was accused of something that supposedly was investigated and now has turned out to be a farce. So let's start with that, Ari. Let's look at the story. The story originally was that there were sexual allegations against Robbie Alomar. An extensive 2.5-year investigation by Major League Baseball and by the Toronto Blue Jays was conducted. They removed all his accolades from Rogers Center and from baseball. He was fired as an ambassador of the game to Puerto Rico and to the Latin American community. And now, the woman that supposedly he attacked has retracted herself and said that she will not pursue legal or civil action against Alomar.
I don't know what to say anymore when it comes to trying to understand why we now exist in a world of it almost seems like pure public opinion, right? I mean, for me, talking about it, I went on the West Coast. I did a couple of news stations there because, as soon as you tweet about controversy, as you know from your experiences on Twitter and on different social media, as soon as someone sees you as a quote authority on something, they want you to expand on it. So, you can imagine I get asked to talk about Roberto Alomar in the court of public opinion about something that people are already, and they're forming their opinions, right? I mean, to me, the great tragedy of everything that's related to Roberto Alomar is that at the end of the day, he's like all of us in this world, he's a flawed human being. He's not perfect. I think Roberto Alomar's greatest victim in the end will be himself. Because, whether or not he turned out to have the kind of relationships with people that would be characterized as exploitative, or whether they were relationships that just went off the rails, clearly this kind of trouble has followed him for a very long time. And I'm just astonished that, throughout all of this, that he's keeping it together, because it's clear that there's a lot of information we don't know. But conversely, I'm also concerned about people who may have been potentially victimized in that respect, because we know he wasn't this perfect, gilded human being that everyone expects him to be. Which, when you go into Cooperstown, right, there's this kind of assumption that you're going to be a good, classy person for the rest of your life. How can we make those assumptions? I don't know Roberto Alomar's inner character. I know that the athlete, I know what he did to help, forge these powerful memories and to make me enjoy baseball and the Blue Jays growing up. But in terms of his morality, his character and his nature and the truth behind what he has or hasn't done, I can only look at the facts. And from what I've seen, there's a lot of Roberto Alomar that has been admired and loved and adored because he's done a lot of good things in his life. But it seems now that because of a few missteps or a few attempts at publicity or whatever it is that's hovering around him now, he's like embroiled in this. It's almost like, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but in a strange way, I saw this coming because, between the Hirschbeck incident and all those other rumors that were floating when he was a bachelor during his Skydome days, karma's a bitch, isn't it? Like some of that stuff comes to roost, and I almost feel like there's just a curse. There's something ominous around him, and it has to do with everything from his nature and really bad decisions.
I mean, and I want to be quite crude with this because really, and Ari, I am very, very, very happy that we were the only network that when the story came out, we didn't publish anything because we wanted to find out the truth. Everybody else ran to the accusations. Oh, Alomar is this. He's a womanizer. He's a this. He got so many wives. He had these. And I said, hold on. Let's look at the perspective of if the story is correct. Let's see what happens 2-3 weeks down the line, because you never know what's going to happen. And now, as I said, 3 weeks down the line, this woman has decided not to file charges because supposedly there was a video of the situation happening at Rogers Center where supposedly there was misconduct, and they couldn't find the video. So, I'm sorry, but you tarnished the career of somebody based on hearsay, and Major League Baseball said that they conducted an investigation of a year and a half, and now this comes out. It's
well. Let's be clear that in conducting their efforts, right? I mean, look, if you're going to tell me that you're going to spend a year and a half looking into an employee's conduct, and you, after all of the time, money, and effort you spent in that, come back to me and say, I don't think Ed should be on our level of excellence, there has to be a reason for it beyond simply allegations, right? I mean, it wouldn't make sense. Why would they want to shoot themselves in the foot with this embedded living legend that's part of their lore and can be so valuable to their future as an organization, unless they felt that the mere accusation, validated through their research, indicated that he might be a loose cannon, he might be a liability. You have to remember that today it seems like a lot of these quote terminations and layoffs and the way corporations treat their employees has less to do with economics and morality and more with wanting to avoid any hopes of negative publicity that could damage and tarnish the brand. Jay and Dan are an example of that. They split up that duo, TSN did, because Dan O'Toole clearly was not the kind of person they wanted to employ. And that's a very loaded way of saying that, he was someone that they viewed as a potential liability. That's why they let him go. People can argue, well, he was also making a lot of money and the organization maybe didn't want to pay him anymore, right? That's not unusual. But I think when we see these question marks of companies that validate their actions by saying that they've done their research and due diligence, I've always wanted to assume that that means something, because why would they want to part company with Roberto Alomar when the benefit that he represents as part of their culture far outweighs the liability of maybe being a guy who had a tendency to do misogynistic things? Clearly, there's more than misogyny here. I can't see them parting company like this unless they felt that there was more than meets the eye from our perspective. What do you think?
Well, and I am not saying that the commissioner's office didn't do their due diligence or the committee didn't do its due diligence, but before you come out with a statement that we are splitting association with this individual, and in every single situation, Major League Baseball has taken action against a player for misconduct it has come out of a legal of of charges being filed legally, not civilly. You know what I mean? And in this case, it was the only athlete that they have distanced themselves from for a civil suit. And I think that that was wrong in the part of Major League Baseball. And I thank the Hall of Fame for taking the stance that his accolades in the field were the ones that inducted him into the Hall of Fame, and they weren't going to take anything down from him.
They won't touch him in the Hall of Fame. That would set the kind of precedent that would unravel Cooperstown, right? If you start taking out enshrined athletes on the basis of their moral character, it's going to be pretty quiet in there. A lot of room. Because if you think about it, between those early pioneers of the Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth era, coupled with the 60s and 70s caliber of athlete, coupled with the 90s steroid laden, I mean, the list goes on and on. Every generation has people who clearly were lacking in moral fiber. And Roberto Alomar has been kind of relegated to the dust heap of unsavory characters. I mean, they put him on the ineligible list. Ed, have you seen the names on baseball's ineligible list? He is in the same category as Marge Schott. You know, think about it. A racist owner who was banned from the game is equated now in the same capacity of undesirable as Roberto Alomar. I mean, he must have done something really bad. Right, and even you look recently, there was another article that came out of another female employee who's accusing him of sexual misconduct. I think we're going to see more and more. I think this is maybe the tip of the iceberg for Robbie. I hate to say it, because I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of relationships he forged, again being a free swinging wealthy bachelor, produce the kinds of toxic outcomes that could potentially haunt him. I'm not implying that there's an agenda against him, but if you were someone who was mistreated by Robbie in the past and you see women coming forward, you'll be now more likely to say, wait a minute, I had something awkward or uncomfortable happen with him. And then it goes back into the court of public opinion. And it's complete lose-lose for both the Blue Jays and Robbie, because it makes it have that aura that I so detested from Maple Leaf Gardens in the 1980s. Remember that? Remember all those crimes they had involving Gordon Stuckless and all those young boys who were preyed upon in exchange for tickets? Did you ever notice how conveniently Maple Leafs as an organization and all their owners got away from that without being stigmatized for it? Think about it. There were literally like child exploitation rings going on in hockey in the 1980s. But because we didn't have journalists who really muckraked enough and could expose the truth, and we didn't want to just simply judge that the organization was fostering that's how perceptions are fickle. And right now, even a hint of exploitation based on misogynistic elements, which is what this is all about, right? Because you read about all the salacious remarks related to this, all the dailies here are reporting it differently. Like if you read it in the Toronto Sun, it's a radically different interpretation than what might be, say, in the Toronto Star or the Globe. I feel for him because he doesn't deserve to be tried like this. Anything that happens to him in a civil or a criminal matter should be in the courts and should be between his victims and the alleged so-called crimes that he committed. And if Major League Baseball and the Blue Jays, after a year and a half, came to the conclusion that they want nothing to do with him, that leads me to believe that there's a lot more coming down the line.
I hope that something gets done, because if there is nothing happening, the tarnish on the game of baseball is going to be huge. That they took down a Hall of Famer, someone that gave his life to the game and comes from baseball royalty, technically.
They took down a Puerto Rican legend. That hurts. Puerto Rico doesn't need that, right? Like when you consider all the plight, all the realities that a typical child growing up in Puerto Rico faces, you want to believe in the heroes, right? You want to believe in the heroes. And when one of them is going through this, like you said, it tarnishes everything, right?
And all what he did, and he still does a lot of work here in Toronto. I mean, that's insane.
His philanthropy is like it's interesting you brought that up because we live in an era now where we seem to be balancing how bad a person is sometimes, or the bad things they've done, with the good things that they've tried to do in the kind of Bill Gates fashion. Yeah, he was the richest man who proprietized an operating system that destroyed competition and made him the world's richest dude. But he's also given away a great deal of his fortune that gets interpreted both by the left and right as good or bad, whether he's trying to, free us from environmental scares and challenges, or just trying to make the world a better place. Robbie represented an opportunity with his philanthropy, his charity work, especially the fact that he sat on important committees, right? He sat on the Hall of Fame subcommittee. He sat on a special ambassadorial posting that he had on behalf of Puerto Rico. And you're talking about a guy who, in his late 40s, early 50s, was probably settling into the next tier of his ambitions with Major League Baseball, right? Like, who knows? Maybe he gets involved at a higher executive level, or maybe he gets involved with the Blue Jays on a higher level. Who knows? But to have this happen now, it's literally destroyed everything. Because how can he even be taken seriously by these same philanthropic organizations who probably want absolutely nothing to do with him? You know the way it is today. It doesn't matter how much money you donate. If you do something that's reviled or socially unacceptable, they're not going to take your money. We have the reverse problem here now in this country. We have donors and sponsors and philanthropists influencing executive decisions by things like universities and hospitals and things like that, sports organizations. So you don't end up getting the most qualified and ideal person who can help your organization. You get your nepotism in play. You're backslapping, my old buddy's going to join the fray and hopefully we're going to be successful. I really feel for Robbie. I feel that if he in fact turned out to be this horrible, wretched person that everyone is perceiving him to be, then you made your bed, you sleep in it. But considering the way technology works today and the way we absorb information, the fact that this has unfolded the way it has and crippled and ruined his life without him even having a chance, I will tell you this though, Ed, his response to it sucked. His response to it was a fiasco. He actually shot himself in the foot, because remember, he used the phraseology when he was responding to the allegations that in this culture, I'm not surprised this has happened. Dude, that's the worst thing you can say. You have to be very tactful. I'm not saying he has to repress himself and not speak his feelings, Ed, but in today's culture, social media, hypersensitive culture, you don't start off by addressing something that's this heavy and controversial by saying, I'm not surprised because, that's how the weather's been. So this is why I'm sweating. Well, no, it has nothing to do with the weather. It has to do with the way you represent yourself and dignify yourself. And I'm sorry, as the only player to ever spit in the face of a major league umpire, it shouldn't surprise me that Robbie doesn't necessarily think twice before he makes these decisions. He's his own worst enemy right now. He needs a good PR rep. He needs somebody to be in his camp who can kind of steer these waters for him to get to the point where fans can see him as closely as possible to the kind of human being he truly is. And right now, fans have no clue. You're trapped between like the Blue Jay fan who's so heavily nostalgic that they're like, no, it's my beloved Alomar. Nobody should touch him. What are you talking about? Versus the cynical baseball fan who's like, oh, great, not another one. Like the sport needed another one of its modern day heroes to get crippled in the court of public opinion.
But you know what surprises me most is that how quickly the media has turned. And that's what upsets me the most. This was one of the guys that everybody went out to try to speak to. That always, or Robbie here, Robbie there, Robbie. But particularly the Toronto media, and all of a sudden now it's like, oh, we don't want anything to do with him because he's not newsworthy. And I said, hold on, let's be honest here. If it wasn't for Robbie, if it wasn't for Robbie Alomar for a decade in Toronto, you didn't have anything to talk about. And
God knows how many newspapers he sold with his play alone. The clutch hits, those moments where you knew that history was literally unfolding before your very own eyes. Because when he came to this city, everything changed in terms of expectations, in terms of anticipation. It's a shame, isn't it? I wrote about it recently. I really miss those years of not having a chance to see Fred McGriff blossom into an almost 500 home run hitter, and should probably be in the Hall of Fame because he's the Matt Sundin of baseball, if you think about it. He really is in consistency. Every year he got it done. And of course, the great, legendary, wonderful Tony Fernandez, who didn't matter which team he played for or how many times he got traded, he always brought it. But when Robbie came in, the swagger, the expectations, Joe was almost an afterthought. Like, with apologies to Joe Carter, by any stretch of analytics, he was lucky to be a fifth outfielder. I mean, 180 strikeout guy, doesn't walk. Yeah, he'll hit 30 home runs and get 100 RBIs, but we knew back then that those were the sexy glorified numbers. Alomar, though, brought it on every level. You watched him steal bases. You watched him get clutch hits. And at bat against Robbie Alomar, from the pitcher's perspective, must have been like passing kidney stones. Excruciating, because he was so compact in that box. Very cerebral hitter, very passionate. Man, oh man, what a player. What a player, and what a shame to only have him for what? It was 5 years, Ed? It wasn't even a decade. He was here for 5 years or so. And if you think about it, he should have been here for 10. The fact that he ends up going to the Orioles to have his best years of his career is one of those bizarre realities where you say to yourself, wow, for a guy who won back-to-back World Series and then left 2 years later, what was going on there? Like, honestly, how did the Blue Jays not find a way to keep a future Hall of Famer, clutch hitting World Series hero with the organization? And then, of course, the Gordash era, J.P. Ricciardi, and then at least Anthopoulos gave us a reason to smile again. But since 1993, we held on to Roberto Alomar, we being Toronto fans of baseball here, as the standard bearer of everything that was good, everything that was holy. And to now think back to those years and being driven by this media narrative that he is now an outcast, we've decided this happened to him. Major League Baseball has concluded it. The Blue Jays have concluded it. Great secrecy. You know what I'm going to release later this weekend, Ed, for my viewers, for my podcasting deal? I'm going to release my interview I had with Shai Davidi, where we talked about that. And in our interview, I asked him how he felt this would affect the legacy and the future of the team. And he acknowledged that, man, this doesn't end well. This really doesn't end well. You erase Roberto Alomar from history, doesn't end well. Very, very, very sad.
So I wanted to go into hockey and talk about the Jack Campbell controversy with his play and people attacking him. But we are in baseball and we are talking controversy. Now we are going to talk controversy of the Hall of Fame, because I think the Hall of Fame needs and as you know, Ari, I have been involved currently in a social media platform called Clubhouse, going in there and talking with different people. Happens to be that there is a room within Clubhouse, a club within Clubhouse called the Daughters and Sons of Athletes, that was created.
Oh my, that's got to be one hell of a room. That's got, that room should be called. It should be called during the day, Daughters and Sons of Athletes, and then at night, when everybody starts drinking and loosening up a little bit, it can be called Big Mommy Daddy Complexes. Big issues, big Freud. They should call it the Freudian room, because I can only imagine what it must be like to be the son, the child of a famous athlete, especially one who's controversial. I'm sure you heard and saw a lot of things.
So the room was created none other than by Lori Moreno and Kelly Stargell.
Willie's daughter. Interesting.
So
yes, the great Willie Stargell.
So,
the underrated Willie Stargell.
And actually, I just sent you a link of one of the stories that I'm following from that room, and that's the story of Beta Pinson the third, Beta Pinson the Senior, and one of the greatest ball players that probably roamed the outfields of baseball in the 1960s and 70s, and that hasn't been given his rightful place in the Hall. One of the other people that I am going to now pursue to see how we can get him elected to the Hall of Fame, and the daughter happens to be in that clubhouse room, is Anita Oliva, the daughter of Tony Oliva. And it's sad to see that players of that caliber are not in the Hall because of technicalities. You know, and
I would argue it's sad to see that they're not in the Hall because they're usually, either African American or from outside of the United States. Like that's what's especially depressing, because that whole era of 60s, 70s, 80s baseball, like you said earlier, we've talked about this before, it's one of your favorite subjects, produced a whole glut of completely deserving Hall of Famers who get overlooked because their analytics just don't shape up. Which is so ironic, because in the old days, you remember what the standards were, right? You had to have a certain minimum just to be considered. And if you missed it, you got forgotten because they put you off the list.
So let's look at Beta Pinson, because Beta is an interesting character. If you look at his hits, he had 2,757 hits. He had 256 home runs, which are, by any chance, they are not bad numbers, considering the size of the stadiums in that era. I mean, to hit a home run in the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't an easy task, because the stadiums ranged beyond 500 feet. So, in today's era, he probably would have 400 home runs easily.
Well, and I think in Pinson's case, the challenge is his numbers. Each of his most important statistics back then to determine whether you can get in the Hall. What were they? It was your batting average, it was your aggregate runs scored, your RBIs, your home runs. That's the things. It was less about looking at on base percentage. It was less about looking at OPS, and they would just end up saying, all right, you're an all-around great player. Pinson was an all-around great player whose numbers just all kind of fell under the radar. Although the stat for me that really impresses me are the stolen bases. But considering the way the game was played back then, you don't put that much stock into it. I mean, he had, just over 300 stolen bases. So to me, again, no, he didn't get 3,000 hits. He didn't even get 300 home runs. He didn't get the numbers that really should have, I think, pushed him over the edge. I think he was just a really, really good player whose consistency in other sports, like we talked about it, Matt Sundin, in my opinion, didn't deserve to get to the Hall of Fame as quickly as some other players couldn't. I mean, he got in there ahead of Brendan Shanahan. In what universe does Matt Sundin get into a Hall of Fame before Shanahan, right? What are the determining factors that are coveted? In hockey, it's still if you win championships. Clearly, that standard has disappeared. In baseball, it's still high, but Pinson, unfortunately, is being a product of the era that he was in, which you mentioned. Ironically enough, he should have been respected for playing in these ballparks. These were not easy environments to play in, and he was a really, really consistent hitter. Do you think a 286 hitter should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame? Can I even ask you questions like that if we're going to be bringing in other analytics? Because it's a simple one. Should a 286 career hitter be in the Hall of Fame? In my books, no. In my books, the one prerequisite that you should probably still have that I'll be most impressed with is if you can hit 300 or better for as many years as possible. And Pinson had a couple, he had some really good years where he clearly demonstrated his skills, especially early on when he hit 343. But in the last 10 years of his career, he couldn't hit 300. And to me, a Hall of Famer is the absolute best in an era that can hit the baseball. That's why Mike Trout will be, when he retires, the greatest player in the history of the game, because he will literally destroy many of these records, and it won't even be a question of whether he'll get in. It's just how soon they can get him in. He could retire tomorrow and he'll make the Baseball Hall of Fame, kind of like Eric Lindros made the Hockey Hall of Fame and only played like 11 years. Why? Because for a short time he dominated the sport. Pinson's numbers, unfortunately, when you consider some of the other players of that era, they just get dwarfed, unfortunately. I think it merits consideration. I mean, like you said, if he would have played a full baseball career, he would have had over 3,000 hits. That's a Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
That was the standard back then, if you had it. So,
yeah, and you know, and then you get into the idea of the teams that he played with in the era that he played with. I mean,
that's a great point. That's a great point as well. And by the way, you mentioned Willie Stargell, right?
Yes.
Hall of Famer Willie Stargell, with his, and I am correct in assuming that, right? Stargell's in the Hall, isn't he?
Yeah,
yeah, he's in the Hall. I don't know. I spaced out for a moment because it has occurred to me that Veda Pinson and Willie Stargell have almost the exact same WAR. So by the metrics of today's baseball, you can make the case that Pinson deserves to be in the Hall of Fame if Willie Stargell is. And yet Stargell, with his 475 home runs, you know, known for being a guy who, you know, could get you RBIs aplenty, a guy who stole 17 bases in his career as opposed to the over 300 that, you know, Pinson had, you could easily make the case that by today's metrics, they're both Hall of Famers. That's why it's so crazy, isn't it? That's what Moneyball did. It reinvented the way that we look at baseball players and their value. But you can't ignore the era they're from. Like you said, if you ignore the ballparks that they played and the kinds of teams they played with, the format of the game. Today, the game feels like a glorified video game. It doesn't feel like a sport anymore. It feels like they're just adjusting it because they want the best aspects of the game to shine through. Like, what isn't better than Vlad Guerrero Jr. smashing a home run?
So let me send you this other player that I was telling you about, which probably you know very well from your days.
Oh, if I know who you're sending me. Now, Oliva, you know, he's been part of that debate for how many decades now, Ed? Like, it's been talked about for a very, very long time to get Tony Oliva into the Hall of Fame. And to me, it was a shortened career, but using the example that I gave earlier with Eric Lindros, if you look at his best years when he played baseball, he led the league in hits 5 out of 8 years. That's insane. How that stretch alone doesn't warrant him in the Hall is extraordinary to me, because what it means is that for a career in which he hit over 300 and demonstrated this kind of consistency, again, you know, baseball was always hard on players that way, right? Like in hockey, you could get away with being the best player for 5, 6, 7, 8 years and you'll get in the Hall like Eric. But in baseball, it was always a longevity issue, wasn't it? You couldn't have a shortened career and expect to get into the Hall of Fame. And I think that in Tony's case, he struggles with that because really he played a grand total of what, 12 years of baseball?
15.
Well, it says 15, but when you consider the fact that he had seasons where he had 9, 7, and 10 games played, he really only played 12 years of baseball. But you know what, Ed? He was an all-star in 8 out of 12 years.
Yeah.
And he finished MVP, you know, second in MVP twice. And some of these seasons are just so impressive. I mean, are you kidding me? He slugged .546 at the age of 32. You know, not a lot of home runs, not a lot of stolen bases, but as a hitter, you know, you got to respect that. This is a tough call. And not only that, look at the years he played. So he came up against players. Like if you look at the year in which he finished second in the MVP race, he was up. Oh, wow, you're not going to won that year, eh? Zolo Versailles. I don't even know if people know who that baseball player is. That is amazing.
No.
Tony Oliva, Brooks Robinson, Eddie Fisher, Carl Yastrzemski, Harmon Killebrew, Al Klein. I mean, Mickey Mantle. You know,
and he faced.
Oh my
Cy
God.
Young, he faced Koufax. I mean, you think of the pitchers that he faced to hit those home runs or to get that average. It's ridiculous. I mean, you can't compare when today's game everybody's a specialist.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly. No, exactly. It's changed. It's changed. I'm going to type this name into the window here, and I want you to help me pronounce it because he's a Cuban player. How would you pronounce his name?
Zoila Versalles.
Yeah, Versailles, right? So
Yeah,
check this out. Versailles, who won MVP the year that Oliva was finished second. There it is. Check this out. I don't know what happened, but I think one year he had a pact with the devil because when he was 25 years old, he had 666 at bats and was the MVP of baseball. But if you look at his career numbers, he was a 242 career hitter. And it's an interesting story. He had one year where he really just knocked it out of the park, and then eventually, baseball is filled with that, and I think that when you find players who go through a stretch of consistency that gets into say the 8, 9, 10 years of baseball dominance, you got to give them their due. It's just the game's not wired that way. It's never rewarded players for short spurts or stretches of achievement. It's usually been, okay, you played 16, 18, 20 years, you were great, and the majority of them were putting you in the Hall of Fame. This is why
yeah.
Kurt Schilling lost his composure. Because our friend Mr. Schilling feels that he should have been in the Hall a long time ago, and there will be many in baseball from an achievement perspective who will say, why isn't he in there? But he also needs a good PR rep like Roberto Alomar because he's just become such an unlikable force.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see. You know, and here goes the next one. You know who I'm talking about because uh, when you see a name pop up in your
Chat.
box,
Mm-hmm. Who we got here? Oh, Mr. Concepcion. Listen, this is the hardest one I think for fans to understand who didn't watch the Big Red Machine and didn't understand the extraordinary reality that were the Cincinnati Reds of that era. If you did, you believe that Dave Concepcion was like your, let's say, let's say. Some of the players on the Edmonton Oilers, right? Because if you think back to those Edmonton Oilers, when you got away from Gretzky and Curry, you had your supporting cast, like a Glenn Anderson or Kevin Lowe. That's what Dave Concepcion is. And so they believe he should be in the Hall of Fame. You look at his numbers, and it doesn't tell the story because we know what kind of an extraordinarily defensive player he was, right? I mean, Dave Concepcion could get it done at the plate and in the field. The numbers don't look necessarily sexy to some because he was a 267 hitter, but look at the consistency of what he tried to make things happen on the bases, trying to steal bases. All-star, 9 times in his life? You really want him in the Hall, don't you? You campaign for that one. You believe that one should. You believe that the children of Concepcion should be able to enjoy their dad in the Hall of Fame.
I want him to get into the hall before he's not here with us. I mean, he's at an age very living in Venezuela in an age that we don't know if he's going to make it. He
I
just
know
came
it's
out,
rough.
he just had a heart attack and just came out of a triple bypass. Let him go into the hall to be with his peers that are already there. There is only 2 players out of the Big Red Machine that are not there. One happens to be Pete Rose, and we know where that is going. And the other one is Conception. Conception deserves to be there. There wouldn't be.
You believe in terms of statistics. You believe in terms of. I mean, you're arguing intangibly. You're saying he was part of that glue that led to the success of the Big Red Machine. I totally agree with you. Same thing with Ozzie Smith, right?
Yeah.
But Ozzie Smith,
But,
Ozzie Smith,
Ari,
yeah,
there wouldn't be an Ozzie Smith if there wasn't a Dave Conception.
that's right.
He changed the game at shortstop for men for decades to come.
He was a trailblazer.
You know, you never had a good fielder with some power hitting situations. He changed that. He made the position a different position than it was when the Brooks Robinsons of the world were playing.
And boy, did Ozzie Smith ever run with it. Now that's a Hall of Fame career. 580 stolen bases, all-star in almost every year in his career. And again, his numbers, he was a 262 hitter. So some people would argue that in terms of his achievements on the field, you didn't write a lot. There wasn't a lot to write home about in terms of offensive capacity, but the sport is so much more, isn't it? Right? The sport isn't about being a 300 hitting flashy shortstop. It's about playing defense. It's about being a great defensive player. It's about being able to rally your team by laying down a bunt or by marshaling the infield and being a true leader. And that's what Dave Concepcion was. And that's why every member of that Big Red Machine will tell you the same thing. He was a crucial part and should be enshrined in the hall as a reflection of that. So it's a compelling argument, Ed. I don't know if a lot of people will agree today because everything seems to be about analytics, and they'll look at his WAR and they'll say he's a 40-WAR career player who didn't really do anything on the field besides just kind of put in a so-called, pedestrian. But see, that wasn't the case. Anyone who watched him and anyone who knows that team will tell you he changed the way they looked at the position so then other players could really rise above, and, whether it was Ozzie Smith or Tony Fernandez. Tony Fernandez reminded many people of Dave Concepcion in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll give you a better one. The World Series, the last World Series, when the Cincinnati Reds won that World Series. If it wasn't for Concepcion, the Reds wouldn't have done it because the last three at bats of that World Series were Dave Concepcion pushing the envelope, and no one did that.
Oh, Ed, you are such a lovely, nostalgic baseball fan in that regard. I mean, I know you followed the sport for decades, and every time we talk about the Big Red Machine, man, that's wondrous nostalgia. That was one hell of a team, and the fact that Pete Rose and Dave Concepcion can't be with them for such different reasons too. Huh? With Rose, we can agree a little bit of humility would have gone a long way. But some people just aren't capable of
it. The reason that, and here is quote unquote what baseball writers that have the right to vote people into the hall said was that Dave Concepcion left the game and went to Venezuela and did nothing for the game. Now, the last time I read the Constitution of the United States, it said you have the right to do whatever you want. You're an individual. If you want to go and farm and help your own country, you are allowed. There is nothing that says that you have to continue in the game of baseball. Your accolades should be there for you. What you did on the playoff field, just because he left the game and didn't do anything after, that shouldn't affect the decision whether you were a good player or not.
But unfortunately, when you live now in a reality where people go on social media and they investigate what a person is doing during their downtime when they get away from the game, I agree with you. It shouldn't influence the way that they're perceived with regards to being in the hall or having a chance to be in the hall, but it does. That's why Curt Schilling isn't in the hall, right? If Curt Schilling was the kind of player that actually gave back to baseball by not doing things that deliberately created unnecessary controversies and a black eye for them. I mean, think about it. He's had controversy at every level, from the loans that he took for his business, where he ended up bilking the taxpayer of the community that he was in I think it was Massachusetts, when he was doing his video game company, to the things that he talked about with Trump, to the things that he said politically that were extremely charged, and clearly anyone who's a free-thinking human being would look at that and go, okay, the guy's got to burn his saddle, and he's not helping baseball. And that's why baseball's kept him out.
Yeah, definitely.
campaigns behind them. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, sorry. How much did you hear that before we dropped?
You are back.
Yeah, sorry. Where was I at when we dropped there?
Camera. Your camera is off, Ari.
How about now?
It's fine.
It's fine now. There we go.
Hold on. Give me 1 second.
Mm-hmm. How about that? Where was I?
Can't hear you, Ari.
How about now?
Anyways,
how about now?
We only have about 3 minutes left, so let's say farewell, and we'll come back next week. Next week we are going to have on the air Veda Pinson III to talk to us about his dad, and we also might have Tony Oliva himself here on the air. So until then, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Spanglish Sports World English Edition. We'll see you here next Saturday at the same time, 11 a.m. on the Singo TV television network. I want to thank my great friend and co-host Ari Shapiro. Again, I did it, Shapiro, for all his great commentaries. And remember that you can go to our website, SpanglishSportsWorld.com, for all the news, articles, and from our columnists and hosts. And remember, Spanglish Sports World. Watch it, hear it, read it, download it, but especially live it. Because Spanglish Sports World is sport, and sport is Spanglish Sport World. In the name of Ari Shapiro and myself, Eduardo Harari, this has been another edition of Spanglish Sports World English Edition.